Let's look at some other structures found in the heart. One structure is known as the fossa ovalis. And I'll remind you what fossa means. We might have learned that in AP1 when we were studying bone markings. But a fossa is a shallow depression. So it's a little depression, and that depression is found in what's called the interatrial septum. So that's the divider between the two atria. And that little depression used to be a hole in that septum. So in the atrial septum during fetal circulation, so you got to kind of think back to a fetal heart, there was a hole there. The hole is known as the foramen ovale. So now remember, foramen means hole. And there was an oval shaped hole in between the right and left atrium. And we're going to learn about why that hole is there. It needs to be there during fetal development. But we'll talk more about fetal circulation when we get to blood flows. But basically, a fetus gets oxygen from mom, right? It gets it from the placenta. It doesn't breathe. And the strange thing is, and once we understand fetal circulation, it's not that strange, but oxygenated blood in a fetal heart enters the right atrium instead of the left atrium. Because again, the left atrium is getting blood flow from the lungs, which aren't working. So if a fetal lung is not oxygenating that blood, the blood entering the left side of the heart is not oxygenated. But blood from mom via the placenta eventually goes into the right atrium, which is the wrong atrium. So in order to get that oxygenated blood to the left side of the heart, there needs to be this hole. Once the baby is born, this hole is unnecessary. In fact, it'll cause problems. So the foramen ovale closes and leaves behind a depression. And you can actually go into an adult heart and see that there's a little depression in that septum. If it doesn't close, we call that patent foramen ovale. Patent means wide open. It means when something is still open. It's kind of left open. It should have closed, but it's open. And sometimes you hear people say they were born with a hole in their heart. Well, this is probably what it was. It's not a hole in the heart where blood's leaking out. It's a hole in the heart where blood is leaking between the two atria. And that leads to a big problem. Because if blood leaks over from the left to the right, that's the direction it would go because there's more pressure on the left, forcing blood over to the right. This does a number of things. The biggest problem is it produces too high of a pressure on the right side. And what happens is this right ventricle gets more muscular because it has a high pressure. So that's a congenital heart defect. It's a defect that's found, at birth, hopefully, and then it can be treated, whether it's surgically or other methods. There's another structure, same idea. It used to be something during fetal development, but then it closes and becomes a ligament. So this is known as the ligamentum arteriosum. Used to be a ductus arteriosus. Ductus arteriosus is a temporary blood vessel. So the idea is if lungs are not oxygenating the fetal blood, why send a lot of blood to them? So during fetal development, this blood vessel sends blood from the pulmonary circuit into the aorta. So there's a little artery that attached the pulmonary trunk to the aorta, so blood doesn't go all into the lungs, but you can shunt some into the aorta. After birth, this thing closes, becomes a little ligament. If it doesn't close, it's called patent ductus arteriosus, or PDA. This is another congenital heart defect which can lead to improper blood flow between the two circuits. Finally, when we look inside a ventricle, there are what we call the meaty ridges, or the trabeculae carneae, And these are best seen when we study heart models in class, but there are these ridges inside the ventricular wall, the surface of the ventricles. Don't forget that a heart isn't all muscle. It also has a skeleton. It's not made of bone, but it's made of dense connective tissues. These dense connective tissues also form the heart valve rings. So the rings of the heart valve help prevent overstretching of the valve, and it helps maintain a proper size of the valve, so proper blood flow. And then the cusps, the flaps, are attached to this ring structure. So there's a lot of connective tissue maintaining the shape of that heart. So that brings us to the end of the anatomy. There's a lot, but you have to go through it in some logical manner, probably by blood flow. I would definitely use these pictures from your textbook and the model in the laboratory to go through all of the anatomical structures. This would be a good one to start with. This is the anterior view showing more of the surface anatomy. This picture is a frontal section, still that anterior view, but now we can locate internal structures like valves and structures attached to the valves like the papillary muscles. Here we see the meaty ridges in there, the trabeculae carneae, a little better, these meaty ridges in the inner surface. We can better see the blood flow through the heart when we use this picture. We can see the ligamentum arteriosum, which again used to be a blood vessel, but now it's just a little tiny ligament. It doesn't do anything anymore. They're trying to show the fossa ovalis here, this oval-shaped depression. Used to be a hole. Now it's just a little remnant. So we look at this picture. And then finally, you can look at the back of the heart. So this is a posterior view of the heart. Most of what you see in the back of the heart is the left atrium. So the left atrium is actually more posteriorly located, but it's definitely left of the right atrium. So here's right atrium. You can see some of the blood vessels like the pulmonary veins and the pulmonary arteries, and obviously the vena cava and the aorta. When we get to coronary circulation, which is coming up next, we're going to talk a lot about these blood vessels on the surface, like this coronary sinus. That's bringing blood from the heart muscle into the right atrium. So really work hard on these three pictures to better understand the anatomy of the heart. In the next video, we're going to talk about how the heart gets blood. So the heart is a pump that pumps blood to everyone else, but it also needs blood. So it's got its own little circulation called the coronary circulation.